Is Boeing really back? There's definitely some good news around the company lately, along with some not so good news too. Now, Boeing is the aircraft maker that everyone loves to hate, and their critics don't need to look too hard to find things to criticize. We had the two horrific 737 MAX 8 crashes in 2018 and 2019, and then after a lengthy grounding came the near disaster of the Alaska Airlines 737 MAX that lost a door plug while climbing over Portland, Oregon. Between the crashes and that close call, there was a separate lengthy grounding and rework needed for the 787. Lots and lots of problems and delays with the certification of the 777X, a couple of lengthy worker strikes, a really embarrassing space capsule launch, and if we go back far enough, there were more problems with the 787's development and its engines, and even more strikes. Yep, there's no question that Boeing has been in trouble for some time now. And after everything that's happened, it's no surprise that any mention of Boeing in the news gets picked up immediately by everyone, whether it's a big story or not. And we saw another example of that very recently. Back in July, many news outlets picked up on an issue involving passenger seats for the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. The news was that the FAA was requiring airlines operating the 737 MAX to check the passenger seat track fittings in as many as 453 737 MAXes in the United States alone. The worry was that some of these seats might not have been assembled or secured properly, and if this was the case, they could come loose in an accident. Now, the news reports wrote at length about the risks involved and the potential costs of inspecting and fixing the issue from the airline's point of view. But how urgent was all of this really? Well, the original story came from an FAA Airworthiness Directive, or AED, which was published on the 27th of July 2026. And crucially, this AED explained that Boeing issued a document called a Special Attention Requirements Bulletin about this issue back on the 10th of December 2025, 7.5 months before the FAA issued the AD. So the airlines actually learned about this potential problem that far back, and this would have been the time when the vast majority of them would have started inspecting their fleets following instructions in the Boeing document. The FAA AD in July simply made these inspections mandatory. Or, to put it another way, by the time this story went public, the issue was most likely resolved. And to be clear, there are no reports of injuries or any incident in general involving this particular issue. Well, as far as our team here has been able to find out. But on the other hand though, there is a lot at stake with Boeing and the company's recovery, not just for the United States, but for the world's aviation industry as a whole. And we haven't actually looked at Boeing for several months now. So, in this video, we're going to catch up with Boeing and see how they're actually getting on. And we're going to start with a story that broke just as we were almost done editing this script. And that news was that the FAA finally certified Boeing 737 MAX 7 after years of delays. How many years, you may ask? Well, that kind of depends on when we start counting. You see, Boeing's first 737 MAX 7 flew for the first time back in 2018. And back then, Boeing expected to get its certification in 2019 and its entry into service to come sometime in the first 6 months of 2019. Now, that was probably a little bit optimistic, but ultimately this didn't matter because the grounding of the 737 MAX 8 and MAX 9 in March 2019 after the second of the two crashes put the certification of the newer variant on hold. That grounding ended in late 2020 after Boeing implemented changes in systems and procedures which solved these problems. And the company really hoped that the MAX 7 would get certified sometime in 2021 with the bigger 737 MAX 10 following in 2022. Now, in case this isn't obvious, here I need to stress that Boeing was in deep financial trouble at that time. And when an aircraft maker is trying to recover, nothing is more important than the ability to deliver aircraft to customers, as airliners are mostly paid for on delivery. So the 737 family has always been Boeing's bread and butter aircraft, which means that they really needed all 737 MAX variants to get certified so that they can start delivering them to their customers as fast as possible. But at the time, this simply wasn't happening, and the delays kept mounting. Now, there were many reasons for this. But the fundamental problem was that the relationship between Boeing and the FAA had fundamentally changed. Now, this is a long topic on its own that we've covered in detail in other videos, but in short, the FAA previously relied on Boeing employees for a lot of its certification work. Now, believe it or not, that process in itself isn't unusual. Airbus has a similar arrangement with the ARSA, the European Aviation Regulator. But the MAX crisis really highlighted that the FAA needed to re-evaluate this arrangement from the ground up. And that in turn meant that they also needed to hire and train a lot of people to actually do the same work directly, and then come up with a new way of working with Boeing to move things along. And of course, all of this took time, causing even more delays. And more importantly, the FAA also discovered some other problems, which brings us nicely to the engine anti-icing system of the 737 MAX. Like most other airliners, the 737 uses bleed air from its engines to power anti-icing systems for its wings and the front of its engines. For the latter, hot, pressurized air is directed to the front of the engine cowl to warm up the engine inlet, but when it comes to the 737 MAX family and its CFM LEAP engines, Boeing found that keeping the engine anti-icing switch on when there is actually no icing conditions, i.e. the air temperature is above certain limits, there was a risk that the lightweight structure of the engine inlet could actually be damaged. And here you might be asking, well, why would a crew have the engine anti-icing on when it's not needed? But this can inadvertently happen when anti-ice was correctly turned on for flight in icing conditions, but due to distractions was subsequently forgotten when the aircraft cleared the icing. Now, to be clear, this would require prolonged use of engine anti-ice when it's definitely not needed, and that structural damage is something that hasn't actually happened to any aircraft despite millions of flight hours. Today, crews flying the 737 MAX use procedures that ensure we don't come close to having a problem with this issue. But in general, the FAA isn't happy about procedural solutions like these and wanted something better. And this is where the changed relationship between Boeing and the FAA really came into play. Now, Boeing wanted an exemption that would allow the 737 MAX 7 and the MAX 10 to enter service with the same engine inlet and anti-icing system as other MAX variants, and a fix to be retrofitted to the whole fleet sometime later. And that's what was done in the past when an issue was discovered late in testing or in aircraft already in service. Boeing sought to certify new aircraft variants with a temporary procedural fix and implement a permanent fix at a later date, and they mostly got their way. Well, not this time. In January 2024, the Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 door plug blowout happened just as Boeing sought this exemption. And with that, Boeing knew that if they wanted to certify the newer MAX variants, they would first need to come up with a fix for the engine anti-icing issue that would satisfy the FAA. And it took them a while, but that's exactly what they did. And I'll tell you more about that and why Boeing cares more about the last remaining MAX variant, the MAX 10, and the much bigger 777X after this. Boeing's recovery is about more than engineering fixes and certification. It's about rebuilding trust. And the same goes for the news that we rely on. Depending on where you get your news from, you might hear a very different story, making it harder to know who and what to trust. And that's why we've been using today's sponsor, Ground News. They put coverage from the left, right and centre side by side, while showing you each outlet's political bias, factuality and ownership, so you can see how different publications cover the same story and get the full picture. Take this story about the 747 that was donated by Qatar to the US, for example. More than 263 outlets covered the story, and coverage is fairly evenly split across the spectrum. However, the headlines tell very different stories depending on which side you read. For example, this left-leaning headline says Qatar Force One was never safe, and that Trump should return it, focusing on the aircraft's broader safety concerns. Meanwhile, this right-leaning headline highlights upgrades to the aircraft's anti-missile defences. Both are DC newspapers covering the same security concerns, but each steers readers towards a very different conclusion before they've even opened the article. So, if you'd also like a clearer picture of the news instead of just one angle, check out the link in the description or head over to ground.news/mentor or simply scan this QR code and you'll get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan for yourself And that's the same plan that we use here. Now, let's get back to the video. Boeing finalised its engine anti-ice fix months ago, but we actually only learned the details behind the system in July 2026. Interestingly, the fix includes additional localised insulation in key areas, but it also relies on a series of inlet turbulators. These are basically a series of specially shaped washers and fasteners located in the inner circumference of the engine inlet just before the fan. And these basically act like a vortex generator, which means that as the air flows over them, it swirls and mixes with colder air. Now, this might sound a little counterintuitive since we don't really want colder air when we have the engine anti-icing system on and it's there to melt ice. But in practice, this isn't actually a factor, as the temperature is still more than hot enough to prevent any ice accumulation. But crucially, when we're not in icy conditions but the anti-icing system is active, the swirling colder air can drop the temperature in the affected area by around 200 degrees Fahrenheit or around 93 degrees Celsius. And Boeing are already making all 737 MAX variants with the new engine inlet setup. But the engine anti-ice system wasn't the only thing that Boeing had to develop to get the remaining MAX variants into service. Boeing have also finalised an enhanced angle of attack sensor system, which was something they had committed to develop when the MAX fleet was ungrounded in 2020 and was a requirement for the certification of the larger 737 MAX 10. And Boeing later agreed to introduce the system into the new MAX 7. This enhanced angle of attack system is basically a digital function that collects flight information and calculates an angle of attack value. So it basically acts as a third angle of attack sensor that backs up the air data from the two physical angle of attack sensors. In practice, this now means that if a physical angle of attack sensor fails, the aircraft's computers will now know which one is faulty and it will alert the crew accordingly, which simplifies what we have to do as pilots. The system will also stop the stick shaker from activating, which is another positive step, because the stick shaker's job is to get our full attention if we approach an actual stall. But it quickly becomes an unnecessary distraction in a scenario where the warning is the result of a faulty sensor. And on top of this, Boeing is also adding physical switches into the flight deck that will enable 737 pilots to silence a misbehaving stick shaker, something we currently have to do by pulling circuit breakers after being guided by a checklist. Although in practice, with the enhanced angle of attack sensor, these switches shouldn't be needed, but they are a requirement by the FAA and other regulators. However, those physical switches are a little bit of a headache when it comes to retrofitting this system to existing 737 MAXs. It turns out that Boeing for some time now has been building all 737 MAXs with the wiring and other provisions for these switches and the enhanced angle of attack system, which means that retrofitting these aircraft can be done relatively quickly, apparently in just a couple of hours. But the bigger headache involves older 737 MAXs, which will need a lot more time for that work to be done. But with that said, airlines will have a couple of years to make these changes, so it should be relatively straightforward to schedule this work when the aircraft goes in for its usual heavy maintenance. Anyway, going back to the big picture here, the good news of the certification of the MAX 7 is tempered somewhat by the fact that this is the least important of the three aircraft that Boeing needs to certify. The 737 MAX 7 does have some advantages, like the fact that it has the longest range of all 737 MAXs. But in terms of sales, it's by far the least desirable 737 MAX of the whole family. With total orders for around 300 aircraft, the vast majority will go to Southwest, who are getting 269 of them. These jets are really important for Southwest, who have a lot of really old 737-700s to replace and have suffered from being forced to use bigger 737 MAX 8s that they just can't fill up consistently on many of their routes. But for Boeing, the MAX 10 is by far the most important MAX variant left to certify. This aircraft is the closest competitor Boeing has against the Airbus A321neo, which is the most popular A320 variant. Currently, Boeing have over 800 orders for the MAX 10 and are expected to get some more once it's certified. And on that front, Boeing completed the last certification flight for the MAX 10 in July. And even though they still have some other work to do, the aircraft certification can't be too far away, since the program's bottlenecks are the same issues that the MAX 7 had to overcome. And then we come to the 777X, and more specifically, the 777-9, that will be the first variant of this jet to be certified. Boeing are about halfway through the flight test program for this aircraft and have recently added a 7th aircraft to the program. Now, as I said at the start, this process has also faced long delays in previous years, partly because of technical problems and partly due to the same new FAA certification parameters that slowed down the 737 MAX 7 and the MAX 10. But recently, news stories about the 777X program have less to do with the certification itself, and more to do with the aircraft's very patient customers. Airlines like Emirates and Lufthansa have now waited around 6 years more than they bargained for when they first ordered the 777X. But as it turns out, they could both choose to wait even longer because they don't want to take delivery of the very first 777-9s that Boeing has built. You see, these early 777-9s were built years ago, and they will need rework to incorporate changes that the FAA mandated during the type certification. This updating process for existing aircraft is called change incorporation, and Liam News has explained it in detail if you want to learn a little bit more about it. But ultimately, this is a very costly and lengthy process for Boeing, which also requires a lot of workspace to complete. And it's a little bit more complicated than it first appears, because the changes needed for each aircraft will vary depending on exactly how far back each aircraft was made. And the news now is that Boeing's customers, including Emirates and Lufthansa, will refuse any delivery of these early aircraft, which means that Boeing now has to find one or more new customers for them, or face the prospect of scrapping them. Initially, there were some rumours that United Airlines might be interested in these jets, which would have been a scoop for Boeing because so far, no US-based airline has ordered the 777X. A United buy did seem plausible since the airline has some of the earliest 777s still in service, but United later stated that they just weren't interested. Now, normally it would be unthinkable for Boeing to accept the prospect of scrapping a fleet of practically new widebodies, but if customers are reluctant and if the cost of change incorporation is too high, they might well have to do it. Boeing have already scrapped one 777-9 that they hadn't even flown once. So even if some of them are sold, more of them could get chopped up. Moving on though, there is some other recent news on Boeing which is a little bit more encouraging for the company, and it has to do with its people. As I mentioned at the start, Boeing's workers went on long strikes at least twice in the last couple of years during contract renewal negotiations. And in 2026, it's the turn of SPEA, Boeing's union for engineers and technicians. Now, we're recording this in the first half of August, and the current SPEA contract is due to expire on October the 6th. In previous negotiations, the two sides fought it out in boardrooms until shortly before the deadline, and then the workers went on strike after a final vote. Again, we are recording this early, and I don't want to curse it here, but this doesn't seem to be where things are headed. The initial negotiations started early with daily meetings that lasted 4 weeks, and both sides actually praised each other for the collaborative atmosphere. And if that doesn't sound impressive, you might want to check out a video we made about the dark history of Boeing's relationship with its own workforce and how it went downhill over the years. Now, this doesn't mean that the negotiations were trouble-free. Despite the early encouraging signs and the positive recommendations for a deal from the negotiating teams, the Workers' Bargaining Unit Council initially rejected the deal on August the 6th. So it's definitely early days, and we're probably going to have to come back to this story once a new contract is signed, hopefully without a strike. But with that said, we're not quite done yet. It's now been 2 years since Boeing's current CEO, Kelly Ortberg, took the helm of the company, and it's probably fair to say that the company is doing better now than it has before. 737 production is going up, and there's a new 737 assembly line in Everett for the first time, a huge move that probably deserved its own video. However, stabilising Boeing as a company is only half the battle. The other half is moving forwards as an aircraft maker, which will ultimately involve launching an aircraft to replace the 737. And in that regard, recent interviews with the Boeing and Airbus CEOs show that, as things stand, Airbus is more keen to launch something new than Boeing is. The Airbus CEO believes that the company will launch a new A320 family replacement in 2030, whereas Boeing CEO thinks that a new aircraft launch will have to wait until Boeing is ready, until the industry, meaning their suppliers, are ready, and until the market is ready, and they're definitely not there yet. Again, this is a really big topic, and Petter has already explained that many airlines and lessors out there would prefer Boeing, Airbus and the engine makers to make sure that their current products are dependable before embarking on a new adventure. And that's a little bit disappointing for the aviation lovers among us that like to see new stuff, but it is in line with what Boeing's current management seems to be focusing on. But to round up, Boeing turned 110 years old on the 15th of July 2026. Its CEO will likely stay busy for some time, and he spends most of his time in his office in the company's Seattle delivery center at Boeing Field, not at the company's headquarters near Washington, DC. And for this reason alone, a lot of Boeing watchers look at this CEO much more favourably than those that came before him. But what do you think? Is Boeing going in the right direction? And when do you think they'll be ready to launch a 737 replacement? Let us know in the comments below. And also let us know if you'd like to see more about the strategies of the two big aircraft makers and more videos about industry news in general. I'm Ben Watts, you are watching Mentor now. Have an amazing week and I'll see you next time.